Chapter 1. The Red Thread Around His Neck. The ballroom of the Château de Villeneuve glittered like the surface of a frozen lake beneath crystal chandeliers, each drop of glass catching the light and scattering it into 1,000 points of brilliance. A full orchestra played from the gallery, their polished instruments gleaming like the jewels at the throats and cuffs of the guests. Outside, the Loire flowed in slow, moonlit silence, its silver surface broken only by the occasional ripple from a drifting branch. Inside, it was champagne and soft laughter, the faint clink of crystal and the rustle of silks. It was the Countess Renée de Villeneuve's annual charity gala, a tradition so well established in the Parisian social calendar that to decline the invitation was considered a minor act of social rebellion. The Countess herself stood at the far end of the grand room, a slender, statuesque figure in white satin, diamonds crowning her pale hair. She moved with the deliberate grace of someone well aware that every eye was upon her. Among the assembled guests was a man whose presence seemed, to those who noticed him, both surprising and inevitable. Paul Marchand, a celebrated art dealer with a reputation for finding the rarest pieces in forgotten collections and for selling them to the highest bidder with charming ruthlessness. His dark, well-tailored suit was unremarkable at first glance, but his tie pin, a small, intricate knot of rubies, drew the eye like a tiny flame. By 11:30, the Countess had called for the final toast of the evening. Servants glided between the guests, their silver trays bearing crystal flutes of golden champagne. The orchestra began a quieter piece, the tempo slowing to match the end of the night's festivities. Then came the moment that would later be dissected by every person in the room, each detail remembered with sudden clarity. A sharp, startled cry, the sound of glass shattering, and a woman's voice, low, horrified, calling a name. Paul Marchand lay collapsed in one of the deep armchairs near the marble fireplace. His head was turned awkwardly to the side, his eyes half closed, the ruby tie-pin glinting faintly in the lamplight. Around his neck, cutting sharply against the whiteness of his shirt, was a thin red thread, looped twice and knotted at the hollow of his throat. For a moment, no one moved. Then the room broke into motion, ladies clutching at their pearls, men calling for the doctor, a servant rushing out into the hall. The Countess herself crossed the floor swiftly, bending over the prone figure with a hand pressed to her mouth. But when the house physician arrived, the verdict was immediate and absolute. "Dead," he said quietly, his fingers at the man's wrist, "and not from natural causes." His eyes flicked to the red thread, then to the faces around him. This was deliberate. The gendarmerie were summoned from the village, their arrival marked by the thud of boots in the marble hall and the scent of the damp night air that followed them inside. The ballroom's tall doors were closed, the great gilded handles locked. None of the guests would be permitted to leave until statements had been taken. Whispers moved through the crowd in quick, shivering currents. Who would strangle a man in full view of 50 people? Why with something as strange as a thread, and what could it possibly mean? Eyes darted toward the Countess, toward her nephew Henri, standing rigid by the windows, toward the pianist who sat frozen at the keyboard as though afraid to move. Near the great mirrored wall, a tall man in a dark coat stood apart from the others, watching with the kind of calm that was more unnerving than shock. He was not French, though his dress was impeccable and his mustaches exquisitely groomed. He had not yet spoken, nor stepped forward, but his gaze lingered not on the dead man, nor on the weeping lady beside him, but on the floor, where a single pale thread, so like the red one, but white, lay curled at the edge of the rug. When later asked, many guests admitted they had never seen him before that evening. And yet, when the inspector arrived and began to speak of statements and witnesses, the Countess crossed the row Chapter 2, the first clues. Hercule Poirot inclined his head gravely at the Countess's request, as though agreeing to take tea rather than to untangle the sudden, violent mystery that had invaded her elegant soiree. He moved toward the armchair with the unhurried precision of a man stepping onto a chessboard where the pieces were already in motion. His small, watchful eyes swept the scene, absorbing details without a word. Inspector Fournier of the Sûreté, a broad-shouldered man with the impatient air of one who disliked his work being intruded upon, stepped into Poirot's path. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, half a question, half a protest. "I did not know you were among the guests. Nor did I know I would be called upon for my little grey cells this evening," Poirot replied mildly. "But the Countess has asked me to observe, and when one is asked by a hostess of such charm—" He spread his hands with a faint smile. "What can one do but oblige?" Fournier muttered something about procedure, but stepped aside, watching with a blend of irritation and curiosity. Poirot bent over Paul Marchand, his fingers careful not to disturb the crimson loop around the man's throat. The thread was not silk, as one might expect in such a setting, but coarse, almost like the string used to tie parcels. Yet its ends were cut clean, as though by a blade, and the knot was neat, deliberate. He did not remove it. Instead, his eyes moved to the ruby tie-pin, gleaming still against the dead man's collar. A strange juxtaposition, Poirot thought, a thread of so little value paired with a jewel worth a small fortune. The physician hovered nearby, still holding his bag. "The constriction marks are narrow," he offered. "Whatever was used bit deep quickly. Death would have been rapid." Poirot nodded slightly, then straightened. "And yet no one saw?" His gaze passed over the assembled guests, their fine clothes and nervous glances. "That is curious. The room itself was immaculate. The servants, now corralled near the door under the watch of a gendarme, looked more bewildered than frightened. No overturned chairs, no broken glass beyond the one that had fallen from Marchand's hand. Poirot's gaze drifted toward the marble fireplace. A faint smear, barely visible, marked the edge of the mantel, as though something had brushed against it recently. Near the smudge lay the white thread he had noticed earlier. He crouched, plucking it delicately between thumb and forefinger. It was identical in texture to the red one, but uncolored and several inches shorter. He said nothing, slipping it carefully into a small envelope produced from his pocket. "Do you believe it is connected?" Fournier asked. Poirot only smiled faintly. "In murder, mon cher, nothing is unconnected. One must merely discover the correct pattern of the threads." The questioning began soon after. Fournier took the role of official interrogator, while Poirot positioned himself to observe, not just the answers, but the posture, the eyes, the hesitation before a word was spoken. Henri, the Countess's nephew, was the first to be brought forward. Tall, athletic, with an expression that teetered between disdain and concealed anxiety, he claimed he had been in the antechamber during the final toast, speaking with a friend who had already left earlier in the evening. Fournier frowned at the lack of corroboration, but Henri only shrugged, glancing occasionally at the Countess as though for silent reassurance. The pianist, a slim young man named André Levasseur, said he had been mid-performance when the cry rang out. "I did not even see him fall," he insisted, voice trembling slightly. Poirot noted the faint callus on the man's right forefinger, not from piano keys, but from some other repeated, precise movement. Madame Rochelle, a dark-eyed woman in a green velvet gown, claimed she had been by the champagne table. She spoke rapidly, as though eager to be finished, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of something when they fell upon the dead man, disgust perhaps, or fear. Between each testimony, Poirot's mind worked silently. A murder committed in such a public room without a single witness to the act required either extraordinary boldness or an execution so swift and subtle it could pass unnoticed. The thread intrigued him most. It was not the weapon one carried without purpose. And the white fragment, a mistake or a signal? When the last of the initial statements had been taken, Fournier declared that the guests would remain under supervision until morning. Poirot made no objection. He simply drifted toward the ballroom's tall windows, his hands clasped behind his back. Outside, the river glimmered faintly, and the wind stirred the bare branches along its banks. He turned his head slightly, noting the faintest trace of mud on the carpet near the window latch, just enough to mark the recent presence of a shoe. He returned to the armchair, his gaze falling once more on Paul Marchand's tie-pin. The rubies seemed almost to pulse in the lamplight. Poirot studied them for a long moment before speaking softly, more to himself than to anyone else. Always, it is the detail that is too much or too little which tells the story. And here, we have both. He looked up at Fournier. I should like to see where Monsieur Marchand was seated before the toast began, and who stood nearest him. I have the feeling, Inspector, that our murderer is not only still in this house, but that he or she is far too calm for my liking. And with that, Poirot began to map the room in his mind, placing each guest like a piece on a board, the red thread running invisibly between them all. Chapter 3. The Gathering of Suspects. By the time the clock in the hall chimed midnight, the grandeur of the ballroom had been transformed into something far more claustrophobic. The tall doors remained locked, a pair of uniformed gendarmes stationed there like silent sentinels. Candles sputtered low in the great crystal sconces, casting uncertain shadows on the gilt-framed portraits along the walls, painted faces of past Villeneuves staring down with the faintly disapproving air of witnesses who could say much, but would not. Inspector Fournier ordered all present to be seated in the adjoining salon. The guests, now stripped of the buoyant chatter of earlier, complied with reluctant grace. Poirot followed at a leisurely pace, his eyes flitting from one to the next as they crossed the threshold. He was assembling a picture, not yet complete, but already the outline suggested more than one layer beneath the glitter. The Countess Renée de Villeneuve presided from a high-backed chair near the fire. Her composure was admirable, but Poirot saw the stiffness in her posture and the tightness at the corners of her mouth. A woman used to managing both her household and the delicate intrigues of high society, she would not allow panic to be seen in public. Still, the subtle tremor in the hand that rested on the arm of her chair betrayed that she understood the damage such an event could do, not just to her reputation, but to her control of this world she had so carefully cultivated. Henri de Villeneuve, her nephew, took a place by the window. His dark hair was immaculately groomed, his white tie still in perfect order, but his jaw worked restlessly as though biting back words. There was a suppressed energy in him, a readiness to act or react that Poirot filed away. On the settee opposite sat Madame Rochelle, her green velvet gown absorbing the light and giving her the look of a figure carved from shadow. She was striking, though her beauty had the faintly dangerous quality of a flame in a draught. It could warm or burn. Poirot noticed she kept her gloved hands folded tightly in her lap, and that she rarely looked at anyone directly except the Countess, to whom she gave small, quick glances as if measuring her reactions. Beside her was André Levasseur, the pianist. Without the music to occupy him, he appeared restless, one leg bouncing slightly. His slim fingers tapped soundless chords against his knee. Poirot thought again of the callus he had seen earlier. A musician's hands, yes, but with another, more utilitarian skill hinted at in the hardened skin. Levasseur's eyes darted between the guests, lingering a fraction too long on Henri, as though some unspoken tension bound the two men. Further down sat a married couple introduced as Monsieur and Madame Charpentier. He was a tall, portly man with the easy affability of someone used to closing deals over long lunches. She, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s whose quiet observation of the others was almost as methodical as Poirot's own. The Charpentiers claimed to be old acquaintances of Paul Marchand. Though in Madame Charpentier's expression Poirot sensed no warmth when his name was spoken, only the faint tightening of lips that might signal disapproval, or something deeper. The final guest was a young woman in a dove-grey gown, introduced as Mademoiselle Élise Boulanger. She was not from the Countess's circle. Her manner was modest, her hands unadorned save for a simple silver ring. Yet there was a guarded intelligence in her gaze, and Poirot noted that while others sat stiffly in the atmosphere of suspicion, she seemed to be quietly studying each face in turn. When Fournier began to speak, his tone was brisk. "We will take detailed statements from each of you again in the morning, but for now, you will remain here under guard. Monsieur Poirot may wish to speak with you informally." He glanced toward Poirot, who inclined his head graciously. Poirot stepped forward, his hands clasped behind his back, his moustaches immaculate. "Mesdames, Messieurs, it is clear that Monsieur Marchand's death was no accident. The method, the red thread, was chosen with purpose. Such an act in such a room, it is audacious, n'est-ce pas? And yet it must have been planned. A thread is not a thing one carries by chance to a ball." His eyes moved from face to face, lingering a second longer than polite. He wanted them to feel the weight of his scrutiny, to know that he had already begun to see beneath the surface. "I will not accuse. Not yet. But I will ask only this. When you speak, speak with care, not only because the law demands it, but because the truth, mes amis, it is like the river outside. It may seem slow, but it will carry all things to the surface in time." Silence followed. The Countess inclined her head slightly, as though granting Poirot the floor. He began gently, not with questions about the murder, but with conversation, drawing out details of how each person had come to the chateau that evening, their acquaintance with Paul Marchand, their connections to the Countess and to each other. Slowly, the outlines of a web began to emerge. Henri had met Marchand only twice before, both times in Paris. Madame Rochelle had known him for years and hinted, carelessly, Poirot thought, at business arrangements of a private nature. Levasseur had never spoken to Marchand, though he had seen him about in certain artistic circles. The Charpentier had known him for over a decade, but offered vague, non-committal descriptions of his character. Mademoiselle Boulanger claimed she had never met him until that night, a statement delivered with such calm that it drew more attention than a denial might have. All the while, Poirot observed the tightening of a jaw, the flicker of eyes toward another guest, the small betrayals of posture when Marchand's name was mentioned. He noted also the absence of certain reactions. No one asked how Marchand had died. No one expressed shock at the strangeness of the red thread. This, too, was telling. By the time Fournier called a halt to the informal gathering, Poirot had the beginnings of a map in his mind, not only of where each person had been when the murder occurred, but of where their true attentions and fears lay. As the guests were shown to their rooms under the watch of the gendarme, Poirot lingered near the salon door. He watched Madame Rochelle pause to whisper something to Henri, too low for him to hear. Levasseur glanced toward them, then looked quickly away. Élise Boulanger left last, and as she passed, Poirot noticed a faint red mark on her wrist, no more than a line, as if from a thread drawn tight and then removed. When the room was empty, Poirot turned to Fournier. "It is as I thought, mon ami. This house holds not one mystery tonight, but several. And before the dawn, we shall see how they are knotted together." Chapter 4. Poirot takes command. The salon was quiet again, save for the faint tick of the ormolu clock on the mantel and the distant murmur of gendarmes in the hall. Poirot remained standing at the threshold a moment longer, his eyes narrowing slightly as he surveyed the now vacant chairs where each guest had sat. In his mind, their positions were still occupied. The Countess Regal in her poise, Henri restless at the window, Madame Rochelle still and smouldering in her green gown, Levasseur's nervous fingers drumming in silence, the Charpentier with their carefully cultivated neutrality, and Mademoiselle Boulanger with that unreadable, steady gaze. Inspector Fournier approached, his boots making the polished parquet creak faintly. "You've been silent too long, Poirot. You have already formed an opinion." "Opinion, mon cher Fournier, is premature. Observation." "Ah, that is another matter entirely." Poirot tapped his temple. "I observe that each of our guests has lied tonight. Not the great lie, perhaps, but the little one. A detail omitted, a connection disguised, a sentiment altered to suit the audience. Such little lies. They are like the small ripples on the river. They betray the stone beneath." Fournier gave a snort. "You think they are all involved?" "I think, Inspector, that involvement takes many forms. Some lie to protect themselves, others to protect another, and some to protect the truth itself." Poirot's eyes moved toward the window where Henri had stood. "And the truth, like our red thread, is never without its knot." Without waiting for a reply, Poirot crossed the salon and stepped into the ballroom once more. The scene remained as it had been when the gendarmes sealed it, save that the body of Paul Marchand had been discreetly removed to a side room. The armchair still stood near the fireplace, a faint indentation in its cushion marking where the dead man's weight had rested. Poirot's gaze swept the room slowly, deliberately, taking in the long drapes drawn now against the night, the parquet floor polished to a gleam, the gilt mirrors reflecting pools of candlelight. He moved first to the window, where he had earlier spotted the faint trace of mud. Kneeling, he examined it again by the light of a small electric torch produced from his pocket. The print was indeed from a shoe of fine leather, but with a narrow, almost pointed sole. The mud was still moist, suggesting it had been tracked in very recently. Poirot's gaze drifted upward to the latch. It bore the faintest smear of something darker, perhaps residue from the same mud. He straightened, making a mental note, then turned his attention to the fireplace. The smudge on the marble mantel was still there, unchanged. He leaned closer, inhaling faintly. Not ash, not soot, but the faint tang of perfume, floral with a dry, powdery undertone, a woman's scent, subtle yet unmistakable. As he straightened, his eyes caught on the rug just before the armchair. There, a few inches from the edge, was a single ruby bead, no larger than a seed. Poirot plucked it delicately between forefinger and thumb, holding it to the light. It matched the stones in Marchand's tie pin perfectly. But the pin, as he remembered, had appeared whole when he examined the body. Curious. He slipped the bead into an envelope and tucked it away. Fournier entered behind him. "We have checked the servants. All have been here for years, and none were near Marchand when he died." Poirot's brows lifted. Years of service do not exempt one from suspicion. Loyalty can fray, like a thread. But he waved the matter aside for now. "Tell me, Inspector, what was your official theory?" Fournier frowned. "That the killer approached from behind while Marchand sat, looped the thread around his neck and pulled tight. In the confusion of the toast, no one noticed." Poirot shook his head gently. "No, it is too clumsy, too visible. Even in the moment of celebration, the act of killing leaves ripples. And besides, the knot, it was tied from the front, not the back. That tells us something very important indeed." "And what is that?" "That Monsieur Marchand knew his killer well enough to allow them close. Close enough to adjust his tie, perhaps, or to pretend to fix something about his attire. No fear, no resistance, until the moment the thread tightened." He moved again toward the far corner of the ballroom, where a small table stood with a guest book open upon it. Pages of elegant signatures and flourished dates filled it, the latest entries from this very night. Poirot's eyes moved down the list, noting which names preceded and followed Marchand's. His gaze lingered on one, the ink slightly smeared as though the pen had been lifted too quickly. Closing the book gently, Poirot turned back to Fournier. We will speak to each guest again. But first, I require to see Monsieur Marchand's possessions, everything he carried tonight." In the side room, Marchand's body lay upon a narrow table, the ruby tie pin still in place, the red thread carefully removed and preserved by the gendarmes. A leather wallet yielded crisp banknotes, several calling cards, and a folded slip of paper bearing a single sentence in neat, angular handwriting. "It is almost time. Be ready." Poirot regarded the note for a long moment, then set it down. "This, Inspector, is no random killing. The note, the thread, the jewel, these are not merely parts of the crime. They are the symbols of it. And symbols, they are chosen." As they left the room, Fournier asked, "And the white thread you found?" Poirot's moustaches twitched faintly. "Ah, that, my friend, is the most curious clue of all. For if the red thread marks the death, then the white one, perhaps it marks the life that was meant to end, but did not." He said no more, but as they walked back toward the salon, his mind was already arranging the next steps. The little grey cells had begun their work, and already he could feel the first strands of truth winding themselves toward the knot. Chapter 5. Initial interviews begin. They chose the library, a long, panelled room lined with leather spines and the portraits of eminent Villeneuves, who had preferred a hunting crop to a book. A tray with coffee appeared as if by instinct. The house was well trained, even in catastrophe. Inspector Fournier took the great partner's desk and spread his forms like a general unrolling maps. Poirot selected a chair set half in shadow, half in lamplight, from which he could observe faces without being the focus of them. "Henri de Villeneuve," Fournier called first, brisk with authority. The nephew entered with a stiffness that read as resentment, until one noticed the quick flash of apprehension in the eyes, some internal reckoning underway. He remained standing until the Countess's voice, gentle but cool, bade him sit. She herself had elected to remain, a sovereign presence by the hearth. Poirot did not object. "There are performances one wishes a parent to witness. You have said," Fournier began, "that you were in the antechamber during the final toast. With whom?" "A friend," Henri answered. "Charles Vermorel. He left earlier." "Earlier?" Poirot's voice was soft. "You mean before the doors were locked by the gendarme?" "Yes," Henri replied, an edge of impatience showing. "He took ill. Too much champagne, perhaps. He was driven home." "By whom?" "The chauffeur." "Your aunt's chauffeur?" Poirot asked, turning a little so that the lamplight caught the young man's shoes. "Fine patent leather, broad-soled, immaculate." "No," Henri said. "Vermorel had his own car." Poirot's gaze drifted to the carpet, then back to Henri's face. "You are a man who dresses with care, monsieur. Your tie, it is a perfect symmetry. Tell me, if a diamond-pointed stud came loose, would you permit a stranger, anyone, to adjust it?" Henri frowned. "Of course not. Not even perhaps a woman with whom you were at ease." Poirot's eyebrows made the smallest assent. Henri's jaw tightened. The Countess did not move, but her eyes shifted a fraction. "I do not see the relevance." "But I do," Poirot murmured. "We will return to it." Fournier cut back in, impatient. "Your antechamber alibi cannot be verified tonight. Until we question this Vermorel and the chauffeur, you remain uncertain." Henri's smile was thin. "I am hardly likely to strangle a man in my aunt's ballroom with a piece of string, Inspector." Poirot made a tiny gesture. "And yet a piece of string, it may be more than it seems." "Merci, monsieur." Henri rose, and as he turned, Poirot noted the faint creak of new leather. The shoes did not match the pointed, narrow impression he had seen at the window. A small relief for the nephew, or a new complication for the case. Poirot tucked it away. "Madame Rochelle," Fournier called. She entered with the controlled poise of someone accustomed to rooms and eyes. Up close, her perfume was discernible. Floral, powdery, with a dry note at the end, a ghost of the same scent Poirot had detected on the marble mantel. She sat, crossing one ankle over the other, the green velvet drinking the lamplight. "You knew Paul Marchand well," Fournier said. "Well is a word with many inflections, Inspector," she replied, a faint smile at the corner of her mouth. "We conducted business on occasion. He helped place certain paintings with certain buyers. He was effective, honest. Another word with inflections," she said coolly. Poirot leaned forward. "Madame, forgive the intrusion into the intimate, but I must ask, did Monsieur Marchand owe you money, or do you owe it to him?" Her lashes lowered for a heartbeat. "Debts are not a matter for a ballroom." "Nor is murder," Fournier snapped. "Were you near the fireplace?" "Everyone was near something, Inspector," she said. "I moved through the room. I spoke with the Charpentier, with Mademoiselle Boulanger, with the Countess. I was not standing beside Marchand when he fell." Poirot's gaze rested lightly on the fine kid gloves in her lap. There, no ink. At the wrist, the faintest dusting of powder. "You admire his tie pin?" he asked, almost idly. Her eyes flicked to him. It was ostentatious. "A ruby bead. It is easily shed," Poirot went on. "One rolls, one is lost. One clings. A careless hand brushing a collar might dislodge it." She held his stare a moment longer than courtesy required. "If you mean to imply that I touched him, say it. If you mean to know whether I killed him, ask it." "I imply nothing," Poirot said. "And I ask everything. For now, tell me, madame, what did you last say to Monsieur Marchand?" She hesitated. Then, "I told him I was done." "With what?" "With being useful." The words dropped like a small stone into a deep well. Poirot watched the ripples in her expression, measured the calm she put over them, and marked the phrase for later. He thanked her. She left without another look at the Countess. A flame in a draught, he had thought earlier. Yes, one that could scorch if a hand came too close. "André Levasseur," Fournier called. The pianist came quickly, sat quickly, and could not keep his fingers still. Up close, Poirot could see the callus on the right forefinger more clearly, hard, circular, not from keys, but from pressure, as though he habitually turned a small tightening tool or wound a delicate mechanism. "You did not know Marchand," Fournier said. "Only by reputation," Levasseur answered. "He buys paintings and sells them dear. I play the piano." "At what hour did you arrive?" "Before the guests. The Countess prefers to rehearse the timing." Poirot interlaced his fingers. "Monsieur, when you play, you see the room differently, the rhythm of conversations, the crescendos of laughter, the pauses. During the final toast, what was the rhythm?" Levasseur blinked. The piece was slow, andante. People were moving less. The servants passed the tray. There was a hush. Then, his throat worked. Then the cry. You did not see a hand at Marchand's collar, a figure leaning close, the quick movement that is not a musician's? "No," Levasseur said swiftly. Then, after a beat too long, "No." "Your hands, they are very able," Poirot said mild. "Do you ever mend them, the pianos, the actions, the fine wires?" He made a little winding motion with his fingers. Levasseur colored. "Sometimes. For friends. It is nothing. A man who can tune to pitch can also apply pressure with delicacy," Poirot murmured. "Merci, Monsieur Levasseur." The Charpentier came next together and were promptly separated by Fournier's insistence. Monsieur Charpentier blustered with geniality that pushed too hard toward innocence. Madame Charpentier answered with a measured economy that suggested she had spent years correcting her husband's narratives in more forgiving settings. "You said you have known Marchand 10 years, Fournier said to the husband. At least, he declared, a clever fellow, knows value. Knows how to inflate it, his wife said when questioned apart, and how to make a past look like provenance. Provenance? Poirot repeated softly. She met his eyes. He could make a story for a painting as easily as he could tell you the weather. And stories, Poirot said gently, they can be woven, like threads. Did Marchand weave one for you, madame? Not for me, she said, and her mouth tightened, for a friend who could not afford the truth. She offered no name, and Poirot did not press it, not yet. But when she rose, he observed the faint ink sheen at the tip of her right glove. A recent signature, perhaps, or a brush with wet script. He noted it, and also the quick side glance she threw to the guest book table as she left the library. Last came Mademoiselle Elise Boulanger. She entered with the composure of someone who had decided to be underestimated and found the role unexpectedly comfortable. Her gown of dove grey made no claim on the room. Her eyes appraised it quietly. When she sat, the silver ring on her finger caught the light, plain, undecorated. You met Marchand this evening for the first time, Fournier said. Yes, Elise answered. Her voice had a restrained clarity. He was pointed out to me. By whom? The pianist. She glanced toward the door through which Levasseur had gone. He said Marchand traded in pictures and people. He did not mean it as a compliment. Poirot leaned a fraction forward. Mademoiselle, your wrist. There is a slight mark. She looked down as though surprised to find it there. Oh, a trivial thing. I work with fabric. You are a seamstress, the Countess asked, surprise touching her tone for the first time. Of a sort, Elise said. I repair textiles for a small gallery, lace, ecclesiastical fragments, old samplers that are falling to dust. Threads, Monsieur Poirot, are my livelihood. Ah. Poirot's moustaches made a small, appreciative curve. Then you would know the difference between silk and parcel string. Blindfolded, she replied, a wryness there and gone. And the red around his neck was not silk. No, Poirot said. It was not. He let a small silence gather. You spoke to Marchand? Only one sentence, she said. He asked if I worked for Madame Rochelle. I said no. Why would he think you did? Because Madame Rochelle had asked me earlier whether I took private commissions. I declined. Why? Elise held his gaze. Because private things often wish to remain so. I prefer the work where the label is honest. Fournier rubbed at his brow. This is a soirée, not a market. Why is everyone transacting? Because, Poirot said gently. Nothing reveals character so quickly as the willingness to bargain. He returned to Elise. Mademoiselle, did you see anyone close enough to Monsieur Marchand to touch his collar? She thought. The room was crowded, but yes. Madame Rochelle stood near him for a moment, and the Countess when she passed with the tray, and she hesitated, and a servant with a folded napkin. I do not know his name. Fournier straightened at that, making a note. Poirot watched Elise's hands. They were steady, no tremor. At the edge of her left cuff, the faintest red dusting, thread dye, or merely a trick of the lamp. He did not ask. He had already learned what he needed for this hour. When she had gone, the library exhaled. The clock on the mantel chimed the quarter, a discreet reminder that the night was only advancing. Fournier stacked his notes, exasperation pricking through. We have motives enough for a congress, he said. Debts, forgeries, whispers, old grievances. But how does one strangle a man in a room like that, unseen? Poirot rose at last. By being seen, mon ami. By being so perfectly placed that the gesture is mistaken for courtesy, the adjustment of a tie, the brushing of a speck from a collar, the leaning close to say the little nothing that passes for civility. He moved to the door and paused, looking back at the Countess. Madame, a small favor. Tomorrow I shall wish to examine the guest book. closely and to speak with your staff. There is also a window latch that interests me." "You shall have whatever you require," the Countess said, voice steady again. "Find the hand that brought this into my house." Poirot bowed. "It is already in my mind, madame, the hand and the knot it tied. But a knot—" His eyes shone briefly. "One does not cut it with a sword. One loosens it, thread by thread." And as the gendarme opened the library door, Poirot felt the tiniest give in the cord of the case, a ruby bead that did not belong where it lay, a perfume that had strayed to marble, a pointed footprint that was not a gentleman's, an ink-smeared flourish in a book meant for elegance. The pattern was not yet visible, but the weave, it had begun. Chapter 6. The first false lead. Dawn approached the Loire as a pale rinsing of grey, and the chateau, relieved of its chandeliers, seemed suddenly older, its gilt subdued, its mirrors blind. Coffee and fatigue lent the corridors a hush more complete than midnight's. Servants moved as though the stone itself listened. Inspector Fournier set about his practicalities with renewed purpose, dispatching men to the village telephone, to the gate lodge, to the garages. Poirot, who had slept not at all and yet looked newly pressed, requested one small thing before the formalities resumed: the staff, one by one, and the piano. The housekeeper, Madame Vautrin, compressed and efficient, with a key ring the size of a nosegay, answered first. "Parcel twine?" she repeated when Poirot asked. "Yes, we keep a roll in the butler's pantry, red from the linen room, white in the stores." "Both present this morning?" Her mouth flattened. "The white, yes. The red. We will find it, I am sure." "We shall," Poirot agreed, with a courtesy that made the doubt almost tender. "And your footman, who attended the trays during the final toast?" "Luc and Etienne," she said crisply. "Luc carried. Etienne followed with napkins and salts. Luc is steady. Etienne is quick." Poirot inclined his head. Sometimes speed is the enemy of exactness. Luc, when produced, was steady indeed, a broad young Breton with hands made for platters and hay bales. His story was simple. He took the champagne, he offered, he heard the cry, he stopped. Etienne, slighter and fox-eyed, gave a quicker version of the same and added, unasked, that he disliked the pianist's choice of repertoire. It was too slow, he said. It put a man to sleep. Poirot smiled at the irrelevance. Irrelevances often tried to hide the precise thing he sought. "Show me, if you please, the butler's pantry," Poirot added, and Madame Vautrin led the way. The small room, with its shining ranks of glass and silver, smelled faintly of starch and lemon. On a shelf, a pegged spool of white twine. Beside it, an empty peg, and, on the scrubbed wood beneath, a faint blush of red, as though a spool had bled a little when lifted. Poirot bent, touched the stain with a folded card, and slipped the card into his pocket. "Someone fetched the red last night," he said gently. "Yes," Madame Vautrin conceded. "But we fetch it often, for parcels, for flowers." Her eyes slid the smallest degree toward the music room, and sometimes for the piano. "Ah," Poirot breathed, "the piano." In the ballroom, the instrument sat closed, its polished back reflecting a dull dawn. Poirot lifted the fall with delicate fingers and peered into the action as though consulting a watch. He did not touch. He only looked, and what he saw made his moustaches give a silky, pleased stir. He gestured to Fournier. "If you would ask Monsieur Levasseur to join us, without fuss." Levasseur came with a tight mouth, a little paler in the daylight. Poirot indicated the bench. "Monsieur, forgive me. You keep tools?" "A tuning hammer, some felt, a small screwdriver," Levasseur said, defensive at once. "That is what any conscientious pianist keeps, if he also maintains what he plays." "And string?" Poirot asked, mild. Not wire for the strings, no, but the humble twine to tie what is loose, to mark what must be adjusted. Levasseur hesitated, then jerked his chin toward the hinged seat. Fournier opened it. Felt, yes. A narrow screwdriver, a small bottle of oil, a bit of folded chamois, and tucked into the corner a short length of red twine, roughly cut. Alongside it, lodged in the seam of the bench's lining, something that winked. Fournier plucked it free with a triumphant little sound, a single ruby bead. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. Even Madame Vautrin, who had remained disapprovingly at the threshold, lifted a hand to her bosom. Bon, Fournier said, satisfaction bright in his voice. Our musician keeps the color of our murder and a piece of the dead man's pin beneath his seat. Levasseur's face flushed and blanched. I do not know how that came. Someone placed it. Someone, Fournier cut in. Or you, monsieur, when you leaned close to your victim as the music slowed. You with your deft hands and your little tools. You who asked Mademoiselle Boulanger to identify Marchand to you so that you might know him by sight. Levasseur's hands lifted helplessly. I pointed him out to her. Not the reverse. Words, Fournier said. We prefer facts. He turned to Madame Vautrin. Who took the red twine? The young man, Monsieur Levasseur, she said, cool as linen. Just before the first guests arrived. He said a pedal strap was frayed. He asked if I had any. I gave him a piece. There, Fournier said, with the air of a trap sprung. We are complete. Poirot had not moved. He regarded the small coil of twine in the bench as one regards the last puzzle piece that appears to fit too perfectly. He looked at the ruby bead in Fournier's open palm a long time, then at the mouth of the bench where the lining had come a little loose. He bent, and with his nail he lifted a thread from the split seam, not red, but white, waxed, the sort a careful repairer might use to tack down fabric. He held it up. It shone faintly. Inspector, he said pleasantly, permit me a small caution. A bead that travels is a social creature. It rolls, it catches, it lodges where it can. A bench that guests lean against, that servants dust, that a pianist sits upon half the night. It is full of opportunities for adoption. And the red twine, he touched it. It is indeed the house's. But a length cut at 7 in the evening is not a murder at 11:30. The one does not prove the other. Fournier set his jaw. You are hedging. I am pruning, Poirot returned. There is a difference. He turned to Levasseur. Monsieur, you will tell us where you were at the moment of the toast? At the piano, Levasseur said, voice shaking. You saw me. Everyone saw me. Everyone, Fournier echoed. And yet, what is easier than to lift a hand from the keys and rise? The music would slow. No one would notice a bar of silence. You pass behind the armchair. Poirot shook his head. No. The knot. Remember it, Inspector. Tied from the front. To adjust a collar, one must face the wearer. The piano is behind the chairs. To arrive before Marchand, Monsieur Levasseur must walk around the arm of the chair and kneel, or lean across him like an intimate. Did anyone see such a thing? No one had seen. They would have remembered, unless they were blind to everything but their own glasses. Fournier's certainty thinned, but the evidence, glittering and red, resisted any surrender. We will hold him, he said at last, for possession, for opportunity, for the lying look of a frightened man. Levasseur made a desperate gesture. I took the twine for the pedal. Ask Madame Vautrin. She saw. As for the bead, I cannot say. I did not touch Marchand. Poirot's eyes softened a fraction. Monsieur, did you repair something else with the twine? Levasseur swallowed. Yes. A strap on the soft pedal and... He glanced, shamefaced, toward the window. The cord that holds the practice rail. It had slipped. I tied it. The knot, he broke off. The knot, Poirot repeated, very quiet. A square one, Levasseur murmured. It holds without bulk. Bien, Poirot said, almost to himself. He looked at Fournier. You see? A man who ties the square knot by habit would not have made the neat, particular knot we found at the throat. A constrictor's knot, if I'm not mistaken, drawn clean and left without an ugly tail. It is not a musician's knot. It is another kind of hand. Another kind, Fournier said dryly. That also leaves perfume on marble. Perhaps, Poirot allowed. Or perhaps the marble borrowed perfume from a sleeve brushing it. Madame Rochelle stood there, yes. So did others. Perfume is a social traveller, too. Still, Fournier gestured, and 2 gendarmes stepped forward. They did not clap irons on Levasseur, but they remained at either shoulder. The message was clear enough for the pianist. His shoulders sank. Word of the discovery went through the house with the quick, invisible spread of a draught. In the salon, Madame Rochelle's eyes narrowed with something like relief, poorly hidden. Henri's jaw loosened. Madame Charpentier looked unsatisfied, like a woman who had expected a more elegant solution. Elise Boulanger, when she heard, turned her silver ring once, very slowly, and said nothing at all. The Countess received the news with a dignified nod and sent for more coffee, as though hospitality could reassert control over destiny. Poirot allowed the current to run. False certainties have their uses. They loosen the true ones. He asked then to see the guest book, which was brought on its little pedestal like an offering. He turned the pages with gloved fingers, studying not only the names but the flow of ink, the pressure, the slight tremors or flourishes that betrayed habit. At the night's end, 4 signatures ran close together. Marchand's bold angularity, Madame Rochelle's long, sloping hand, Monsieur Charpentier's jovial loopings, and, between them, a smaller script, Elise Boulanger's, clean and unornamented, the dot over the I placed with careful exactness. A faint smear trailed across the margin as though a cuff had brushed the wet. Madame Charpentier, Poirot asked when she was summoned, you signed after Monsieur Marchand? I did, she said. He jostled the table. His manners were not improved by success. And your glove? She glanced at the right hand. I removed it to sign. Then the ink upon it. Her mouth tightened. I replaced it too quickly. Forgive me, Poirot said with a bow. He returned the book to its pedestal and let the silence close again. Outside, the cloud lightened. A strip of pale gold came into being above the trees. Fournier re-entered, having spoken by telephone with the village. Vermorel exists, he said shortly. His chauffeur confirms the illness and early departure. As for Levasseur, the magistrate will authorize detention for questioning. Poirot nodded, as though consenting to the weather. Detain whom you must, Inspector, but regard this in your mind. A bead that wanders, a twine cut at the benign hour, a knot that belongs to a different profession. Our first culprit, he is convenient, yes, but convenience is rarely the companion of truth. You truly think him innocent? I think, Poirot said, looking toward the river where the first light made a trembling road, that the murderer watched the discovery of that ruby with very great satisfaction. And that satisfaction, it is the thread I will follow. He turned back to the room, where faces composed themselves into hope, into fear, into indifference, each a mask rehearsed in society's long theatre. Somewhere among them, a pulse had steadied with the arrest of a pianist. Poirot did not yet know whose, but he felt, with the same small certainty with which a tailor knows a seam will split, that the wrong knot had just been tied, neat, persuasive, official, and a wrong knot to a certain kind of hand is an invitation. Chapter 7. The Psychological Game. By 10 o'clock, the chateau had the brittle courtesy of a hotel after a scandal. Coffee trays circulating with exaggerated tact. Doors opened a shade too quietly. Conversation pitched in the register of people pretending not to listen. Inspector Fournier had his prize in custody, and the household, sensing the relief of an official conclusion, leaned toward it as toward a banister. Poirot, who distrusted banisters, requested thread. "Both colors," he said to Madame Vautrin, with a bow that made the request feel like a compliment. "A little red, a little white, and if you please, brown paper. 2 sheets only." The library became his stage. He placed the sheets on the partner's desk, cut them into neat parcels, and weighted them with thick books. Then he sent for the guests, not in order of rank, but of utility to his purpose. When they had gathered, he smiled upon them with a serenity that was nearly pastoral. "Mesdames, messieurs," he began. "Inspector Fournier is content for the moment. He has in his hand, figuratively, a red thread and a ruby bead, and with them he would bind our case. But I—" he kissed his fingertips, serenity sharpened. "I am not content. There is still a pattern to see. Will you indulge me in a little experiment of etiquette? We shall play at being shopkeepers." They blinked at him, the Countess very slightly, as if conceding a parlor diversion, Henri with visible irritation, Madame Rochelle with that dangerous stillness, Levasseur pale but attentive between the 2 gendarmes in the doorway, the Charpentiers wary, Élise Boulanger watchful and unreadable. "Each of you," Poirot went on, "will tie this parcel as you would if you were alone, unobserved, and in a hurry, not to be inelegant. It is a small thing, but small things, they are faithful to their masters." He separated 2 lengths of twine, one white, one red, and laid them beside the brown paper. "Madame Charpentier, you will begin? Forgive me. It is merely a matter of sequence." She drew off her right glove with the brisk precision of a woman who has spent a life writing checks at tables not made for writing. She tied quickly, competently, with a clerk's economy, cross, wrap, square knot, and smoothed the ends with a decisive pat. Poirot watched the set of her shoulders ease fractionally when she saw his nod. Monsieur Charpentier followed with a jovial muddle of loops that required a second attempt. He laughed at himself. His wife did not. Henri came next, tying a compact, slightly fussy knot that was very neat and not very strong. Poirot smiled. "The man whose tie is beautiful also ties a beautiful bow," he murmured, and Henri flushed. Madame Rochelle stepped forward without comment. Her hands in kid gloves were precise. She tied as women of a certain generation wrap bouquets, 2 firm crossings, a twist to pull the string under itself, and a tug delivered with elegant impatience. The knot was sound, the ends clipped short. As she stepped back, the perfume that had ghosted the mantle seemed to move with her. Levasseur, under guard, tied a square knot as he had admitted earlier, then looked up as if at a schoolmaster. Poirot inclined his head gravely and replaced that parcel with another, as though filing an exercise. At last, Élise came. She did not remove her glove. Instead, she slipped 2 fingers of the right hand free and, with the tips bare, touched the twine as one touches thread one has dyed oneself. She tied without flourish, a constrictor's knot drawn flat and clean, the ends lying obedient, the twine angled so the pressure would cinch if the parcel strained. It was a conservator's knot, invisible under cloth, a knot intended to hold until the day someone with knowledge loosened it. Poirot said nothing. He looked at her hands a moment longer than courtesy permitted, then offered her the red twine. "Again, mademoiselle. Perhaps red requires a different touch." She met his gaze and retied the knot exactly as before. When she had finished, she set the parcel down as though placing a sleeping child. Silence had a pulse in it now. Fournier shifted, vexed and fascinated despite himself. "Useful parlor tricks, Poirot," he said. "But they prove only that people tie differently." "They prove," Poirot answered softly, "that one person here ties as our murderer tied." He let the implication hang. Not accusation. Not yet. A draft moving a curtain. Now, if you please, a little conversation." He turned to Madame Rochelle as if idly. "Madame, last night you told Monsieur Marchand you were done with being useful." "Useful in what?" "In placing," she said coolly. "Finding homes for objects that needed discretion. Objects such as a painting with an uncertain past." "Such as that." "And the story that accompanies the painting. Who wrote it? You or Marchand?" Her nostrils flared. "We both did. The buyers always want a romance." "The romance," Poirot murmured, "is a red thread that leads credulity around the neck." He let his eyes drift to Madame Charpentier. "Madame, you spoke yesterday of a friend who could not afford the truth." "The friend, was it yourself?" She held his gaze without flinching. "No." "Then the friend is in this house?" Her lashes dropped. "I will not answer that." "You have answered," he said gently, and turned before resentment could sharpen. He faced Henri. "Monsieur, your friend Vermorel, he took ill very suddenly. You fetched him a glass of water?" "No," Henri said, surprised. "The chauffeur did." "And you returned to the antechamber for what? A handkerchief? A cigarette?" "To look for my cigarette case," Henri said after a fraction's pause. "I had mislaid it." "Just so." Poirot's tone was agreeable. "And you found it?" "No. Perhaps because it was in your waistcoat pocket." Poirot's eyes glinted. "Men often search for what they are already holding when they wish to be somewhere they are not supposed to be." Henri's color rose. "Are you accusing me of skulking?" "I am accusing you of being young," Poirot said kindly, and the anger, deprived of a target, withered. He pivoted again, quickening the rhythm before anyone could find a safe footing. "Mademoiselle Boulanger, you declined a private commission from Madame Rochelle." "Why?" "Because I prefer my work to be named for what it is," Elise said, "not to be smuggled into a provenance it does not deserve." "And yet," Poirot said softly, "you came here last night at the Countess's invitation. A grand house, a grand room, and a man who made his living smuggling reputations. He approached you at least once. He asked if you worked for Madame. He was attentive?" "He was curious," she said, and a dry note crept in. "Men like that are always curious how much thread it takes to hold a story together." "And how much to cut one apart," Poirot said. His gaze fell to her wrist. The faint red line was less visible in daylight, but not gone. "You have a mark, mademoiselle." "From work?" "From work," she said. "What work last night?" Her eyes flashed, the first heat he had seen in her. I tied the sashes on the curtains when the draught lifted them. The window had been opened earlier. Someone had not latched it. "Someone with a pointed shoe," Poirot murmured. A tremor went through the room. Madame Rochelle's eyes shifted a fraction. The Countess's hand settled more firmly on the arm of her chair. "Enough," Fournier interjected. "If you have an accusation, make it." "Accusations," Poirot said pleasantly, "are crude instruments. I prefer the subtle pressure." He lifted the parcels one by one and placed them, like offerings, before the people who had tied them. "Here is what I think. Our murderer rehearsed. There is evidence of red twine fetched early, of a knot tied with knowledge not of music, but of textile. There is perfume on marble that is not a proof, a footprint at a window that is not an escape but a draught maker, to slow the air and stir the curtains so that a person leaning close might be hidden one instant longer." He set the last parcel before Elise and did not look at her. "There is also a note in Marchand's pocket. It is almost time. Be ready. Time for what? For a sale? For a blackmail payment? For a confrontation in a chair where the man cannot easily rise without making a scene? I think the writer of that note wanted privacy in a public room. A paradox, yes, but the safest screen of all." "What are you implying?" Madame Rochelle asked, voice very low. "That the hand that killed did so as if adjusting a tie, murmuring something playful or cruel," Poirot replied. a hand that knew exactly how much pressure would close the knot and how little movement would draw attention. He let the words settle, and then, lightly, "Madame Vautrin, would you be so good as to bring the napkin a footman used last night to brush a speck from Monsieur Marchand's lapel? He was brushed, I think, yes, by a conscientious servant." Madame Vautrin hesitated, for the first time since dawn. "Etienne prides himself on vigilance," she conceded. "He keeps a folded napkin for such moments." "And if I told you that napkin bears a smear of red, faint as a whisper?" Poirot asked. "That would be the dye of a cheap twine, transferred when a hand that had just knotted it reached for respectability and pretended to dust." A crack ran through the quiet now. Henri turned toward Madame Rochelle involuntarily. She did not dignify the glance. Madame Charpentier made a small sound, immediately suppressed. Levasseur, forgotten for the moment by his guards, stared at the floor as if it might produce a melody. Poirot did not press. He withdrew his hand from the parcels as a fisherman lets out line. "I will not open the napkin yet," he said. "I will not ask for confessions, but I will ask for truth. If there is someone here who brushed that lapel, who touched that collar, who opened that latch, say merely this, that you did. We will not leap to the noose. We will consider why." No one spoke. But something shifted in Elise's stillness. A breath caught, not fear, something knotted tighter. The Countess's gaze, cool as river water, slid to Henri and away again. Madame Rochelle's hand tightened until the kid glove creaked. Poirot gave them a gentle smile. "Bon, then we shall allow time to do its work. Truth, you remember, flows." He rose. "Inspector, keep your man, for now. But keep also your patience. Before the day ends, the person who is most relieved at Monsieur Levasseur's arrest will do something imprudent. They will try to secure a document, to warn an ally, to bargain or to flee. There not, it will slip." He looked once at each face in turn, letting his eyes rest last and longest where resolve had replaced calm. He said nothing to that person, and the person said nothing to him. Yet between them a thread drew taut, thin, invisible, and very nearly ready to sing. Chapter 8. A Secondary Mystery. By the time the chateau's bells chimed 11, the air inside had acquired a faint metallic sharpness, as though the tension itself had a taste. Guests were scattered to their respective quarters under discreet supervision, the library left in its usual order. Levasseur remained under guard in a small sitting room off the east wing, a tray of untouched breakfast cooling beside him. Fournier seemed content to let the case simmer, his pianist in possession satisfying the magistrate's appetite for progress, while Poirot moved as a man does when listening for a faint sound in a larger silence. It was the Countess who came to him first, her white silk morning gown immaculate despite the sleepless night. "Monsieur Poirot," she said in a voice that suggested her patience was an art she rarely practiced, "my household cannot remain in this state. If there is more to this game you are playing, I would prefer you advance it." Poirot inclined his head. "Madame, it is no game. It is a tapestry in which I see one corner being picked apart, even as we speak." She frowned. Meaning, he said, "that when a murder occurs, it is not the only crime in the room. There is often another, quieter, one that slips by under its cover." He had no more than spoken the words when Madame Vautrin appeared in the doorway, her expression pinched. "Madame la Comtesse," she said, "I beg pardon, but I must inform you, your study has been entered. The bureau drawer was found open." The Countess's eyes flashed once. "What is missing?" "A document," the housekeeper replied, "from the correspondence file, the envelope marked Testament de 1918. Poirot saw the ripple this caused. In the shadows of the hall, Henri had paused mid-stride, his shoulders stiffened, but he did not turn toward them. Madame Rochelle, who had been descending the staircase, altered her pace by a fraction, glancing down at her gloved hands as if examining an invisible thread. Elise Boulanger, crossing the corridor with a covered tray, did not look up at all, but the silver ring on her finger caught the light like a wink. "When was this discovered?" Poirot asked. "Not half an hour ago," Madame Vautrin said. "The room was closed when I passed earlier. I returned to deliver the morning post, and the drawer was open." Fournier arrived at the last words, his manner already set to interrogation. "Who has access to the study?" "The Countess," Madame Vautrin replied. "And myself. The key is kept in the butler's cabinet." "Then we will search the cabinet," Fournier said. But Poirot, turning toward the Countess, spoke more gently. "Madame, what was in that testament?" "An earlier will," she said. "Superseded, but certain provisions differ from my current intentions." "For the benefit of?" Poirot asked. Her gaze cooled. "Family." Henri moved then, stepping into the room. "You think I took it?" "I have not been near your study, Aunt." "No?" Poirot's eyes softened as he approached him. "And yet, Monsieur Henri, it is curious that you passed the study corridor to reach the morning room. Did you pass it just now?" "I did," Henri admitted. "But the door was closed. And you heard nothing?" "Nothing." "Strange," Poirot murmured. "For a drawer in that bureau, it sticks. One must pull it sharply. It makes a little sound. Like the pop of a cork." Henri's jaw tightened. "Perhaps the thief has a lighter touch." "Perhaps," Poirot allowed. He turned back to Fournier. "We will not find the document in the pockets of our murderer. It is in the pocket of someone else entirely, someone who hopes to use it now while eyes are turned toward a red thread and a ruby bead." "Then we search all rooms," Fournier said grimly. "Non, non," Poirot said, raising a hand. "A search will drive the fox to ground, but it will also drive him to teeth. Better to set a trail of scent and see who follows it." He asked Madame Vautrin to fetch a sheet of paper and a fountain pen. On the paper, in his neat, precise hand, he wrote a short note. "The document you seek is safe. It will be returned if you ask in person, by noon." He folded it into a blank envelope and left it on the small table in the corridor outside the library. "Now," Poirot said, "we wait, and while we wait, I would like to see the window latch in the ballroom once more." In the empty room, he crossed to the tall window and examined the brass catch with his little torch. The faint smear of mud was drying now, leaving a shadowy stain, but the mark on the latch itself was clearer in the daylight. A faint nick, as though a thin blade had lifted it. Poirot traced it with one finger. "It was not left open for a draught only," he murmured. "It was tested. Someone wished to know whether it would yield quickly." He stood a moment longer, looking out over the river, before returning to the hall. Through the half-open library door, he could see the decoy envelope lying untouched. Fournier, posted at a discreet angle, watched it with the air of a man waiting for a card to turn. The first to pass was Madame Charpentier, en route to the morning room. She spared the envelope a curious glance, but did not break stride. Monsieur Charpentier came soon after, coffee cup in hand, and did not seem to see it at all. Henri appeared 10 minutes later. He looked directly at it, but kept walking, his pace unchanged. It was Madame Rochelle who paused. She came slowly down the corridor, the rustle of green velvet announcing her before she appeared. Her eyes fell upon the envelope. She stopped, regarded it a moment, then glanced around. Seeing no one, she bent, only to straighten again without touching it, continuing on her way with an expression Poirot could not quite read. And then, 15 minutes before noon, Elise Boulanger emerged from the side passage carrying nothing at all. Her steps were quiet. Her eyes, when they fell upon the envelope, did not flicker. She stooped, lifted it, weighed it in her palm as though judging its contents, then slipped it into the pocket of her skirt before turning toward the back staircase. Fournier moved to intercept, but Poirot touched his arm. "No, let her think she has won this point. The more certain she is now, the more careless she will be later. And when she is careless, mon ami, we shall see the true color of her thread." The inspector grimaced, but obeyed. Elise disappeared up the stair, the envelope a pale secret against the grey of her gown. Poirot stood in the corridor a moment longer, listening to the faint creak of her steps fade into the hush above, and in his mind the two mysteries, the murder and the theft, began to twine together like strands of the same rope. One was red, one was white, and somewhere, in the knot where they met, was the truth. Chapter 9. Hidden Connections. The noon hour came and went, and with it the faintest shift in the atmosphere of the house. The sun had broken free of the morning mist, its pale light falling through tall windows and gilding the dust motes in the air. Yet the guests seemed less warmed than exposed, as if each beam was a probing glance. Poirot, who took his luncheon alone in the small breakfast room, observed this change with quiet satisfaction. The theft in the Countess's study had unsettled them. This was evident in the nervous pacing of Henri in the West Hall, the sharpened tone of Madame Rochel's conversations, and the sudden, careful absence of Mademoiselle Boulanger from all public rooms. Inspector Fournier, less patient with subtlety, pressed Poirot for an immediate confrontation. "We have her," he said in low, emphatic tones. "You saw her take the bait. She has the document. Perhaps she even has the red twine hidden in the same pocket." Poirot sipped his tisane and raised one eyebrow. "Mon cher, if we seize her now, we gain an object but lose the truth. Do you wish to prove that she has sticky fingers, or that she has tightened a fatal knot? The latter requires that we allow her to play her next card." Fournier gave a sound somewhere between a snort and a sigh, but he subsided, muttering about Belgian patience. After luncheon, Poirot took a slow circuit of the chateau. In the salon, he found Madame Charpentier alone, seated by the window with a piece of embroidery stretched on its frame. Her needle moved with practiced precision, though the pattern, a spray of red poppies, seemed to have been chosen for speed rather than sentiment. "An industrious occupation," Poirot remarked, settling into a chair opposite her. "It passes the time," she replied without looking up. "You spoke, madame, of a friend who could not afford the truth," Poirot said gently. "I think now that friend may have been connected to Monsieur Marchand in a way you did not wish to reveal." The needle paused in its descent. "You think too much, Monsieur Poirot." "I am paid for it," he said with a small smile. "This friend, did they also know Madame Rochelle?" Her lips compressed. "Everyone in certain circles knows Madame Rochelle. She is a broker of opportunity." "Opportunities for gain or for ruin?" Poirot asked softly. Madame Charpentier's eyes lifted to his, and for a moment he thought she might answer plainly, but she only said, "Sometimes both," and returned to her stitching. In the corridor beyond, Poirot encountered Henri, who was pacing again. He stopped at once when he saw the detective. "Still prowling?" Henri asked, with a thin attempt at levity. "Still listening," Poirot corrected. "And I've heard something interesting, that you and Monsieur Levasseur have met before." Henri's expression flickered. "Once or twice at my aunt's musicale." "And that you were seen speaking with him on the terrace last week," Poirot continued. Henri shrugged. "He's a musician. I'm a patron of the arts. That is all." "Ah, but the arts have many patrons," Poirot murmured. "Some pay for music, others for silence." Henri's jaw tightened, but he said nothing more. The next thread was found in the drawing-room, where Madame Rochelle was at the escritoire, writing a letter. She did not startle when Poirot entered, but the pause in her pen was a fraction too long. "You write to a friend, madame?" he asked pleasantly. "To my lawyer," she replied, blotting the page. "These are unpleasant times. One must have one's affairs in order." "Affairs of business or of the heart?" Poirot inquired. She smiled without warmth. In my world, they are the same thing. And in Marchand's, also the same, she said. Perhaps that is why we understood each other. She folded the letter and sealed it with a quick, efficient motion. But I am not in the habit of killing my business partners, Monsieur Poirot. I find them far more useful alive. Until they cease to be useful, Poirot said mildly. Until they cease to be discreet, she corrected. It was Elise Boulanger, however, who provided the most telling moment of the afternoon. Poirot found her in the conservatory, ostensibly examining the hothouse orchids, though her gaze was fixed beyond the glass to the river. The pale winter light caught in the silver of her ring. A beautiful view, Poirot said, stepping to her side. It hides nothing, she replied. The water reflects everything above it. Unlike some people, Poirot said. She glanced at him then, a fleeting smile touching her lips. You think I took the will. You think I tied the thread. Perhaps you are right. Perhaps you're only chasing shadows. Ah, mademoiselle, Poirot said, shadows are very revealing. If you watch them long enough, they tell you where the light is. She did not answer, but the faintest tightening of her jaw told him she understood that he was, in truth, still watching her. Later, in the library, Poirot spread out the mental map he had been drawing since the night before. The connections were clearer now. Madame Rochel's placement of art and stories, Madame Charpentier's nameless friend and aversion to provenance, Henri's unacknowledged link to Levasseur, Elise's precise textile-trained knot. And through them all, Paul Marchand, collector, dealer, manipulator, holding each thread until someone decided to pull one too hard. Fournier entered, carrying a small slip of paper. From the magistrate's office, he said. Background on Marchand. He was under investigation in Paris for fraud, selling forged works to foreign buyers. Two names turn up often, Rochelle and an anonymous textile restorer who supplied period fabrics for authentication. Poirot's brows lifted. An anonymous restorer? Ah, mon ami, there is no anonymity in craft. The knot always betrays the hand. The inspector leaned on the desk. You think this textile restorer is Mademoiselle Boulanger? I think she has unpicked more than one false history for Marchand, Poirot said. And perhaps, when she refused him this time, she became dangerous to his plans, or... He paused, fingertips tapping together. He became dangerous to hers. Fournier straightened. And the will? How does that fit? That, Poirot said, is the white thread, parallel to the red, yet twisted together. The theft of the will benefits someone else entirely, but when two crimes are committed in the same house on the same night, it is rarely coincidence. They are like dancers in the same set, different steps, same music. He looked toward the window, where the winter light was beginning to fade again. We will let them dance a little longer, Inspector. Soon, the one who thinks themselves most secure will trip. Fournier grunted. And if they don't? Poirot smiled, thin and precise. Then, mon cher, I shall step on their foot. Chapter 10. Poirot's secret clue. By the time afternoon shadows began to pool along the parquet, Poirot had excused himself from Fournier's company and disappeared into the quieter parts of the chateau. His tread was soft on the thick carpets, his movements unhurried, but his eyes, those small, watchful eyes, were alert to every displaced object, every faint scent, every trace of what had been touched and replaced in haste. He began in the ballroom, returning to the armchair where Marchand had been found. The servants had restored the room to its formal order, but Poirot's mind still saw the scene as it had been. The champagne glasses, the music, the thin crimson line at the hollow of the man's throat. He lowered himself into the same armchair, arranging his body to mimic the victim's position. He closed his eyes and let the imagined room move around him. Voices drifting past, a tray of drinks, the touch of a hand on the collar in the guise of tidying. It would have to be someone trusted enough or innocuous enough not to prompt a start. The knot would be tied swiftly, the ends hidden beneath the collar's fold, the conversation continuing for a beat or two before the pressure closed. Opening his eyes, Poirot leaned forward. There, under the right armrest, where the fabric met the carved wood, was something the gendarmes had missed, a faint streak, no longer than a fingernail, of red. He touched it with the edge of a handkerchief and examined the transfer, a residue of dye. Twine dye. It was not simply the thread at Marchand's throat that bore color. At some point, the murderer's hand, still marked with the same dye, had rested here. Tiens, he murmured. A left hand to knot, a right to steady. That is useful. He did not call for Fournier. This clue, small as it was, would remain his alone for now. Instead, he crossed to the guest-book pedestal. On a whim, he lifted it slightly and examined its base. There, caught in the small crack between the wooden stand and the marble top, was a single fiber, fine, pale, and slightly fuzzy. Cotton, but of a kind more likely to be found in the lining of a servant's jacket or apron than in evening dress. Pocketing it, Poirot moved on. He took the back stairs to the service wing, pausing in the narrow passage that led to the linen room. The door stood ajar. Inside, neat shelves of folded napery, cloths, and spools of cord were stacked in perfect order. The red spool peg remained bare, but in the waste bin beneath it was a scrap of paper toweling, faintly stained pink, as though someone had tried to wash dye from their fingers. Poirot folded the scrap and added it to his collection. By the time he returned to the main corridor, the house felt different. The afternoon's hush had shifted toward an expectant quiet, the way a theater falls still when the curtain is about to rise again. In the salon, Madame Rochelle was seated with the Countess, murmuring something too low for Poirot to catch. Both women stopped speaking when he entered. "Mesdames," he said with a slight bow. "The weather is turning. By evening, perhaps, a fog. And fog, you know, makes every sound seem closer." It was a remark without obvious relevance, but he saw the flicker it caused. The Countess's glance toward the window, Madame Rochelle's eyes narrowing just enough to betray calculation. Later, when Fournier sought him out, Poirot was in the library, apparently absorbed in the bindings of a row of travel memoirs. "You vanish for hours," the inspector said, and returned, quoting the weather. "Did you at least learn something?" Poirot's mustaches twitched. "Something small, Inspector. The smallest of things. A smudge here, a fiber there. But to the mind attuned to order, the small thing out of place is like a shout. And what do these small things shout? That our murderer used the left hand to knot the thread, and that at some point after the knot was tied, the same hand, still stained with dye, rested on the arm of the victim's chair." Fournier frowned. "A left-handed killer, that narrows it." Poirot lifted one hand in a delicate shrug. "It is not proof, only a direction, and as for the fiber, that is my own little curiosity. One cannot yet tell if it belongs to the murderer or to another shadow in the house." The inspector eyed him. "And you plan to keep this to yourself until you have the whole picture?" Poirot smiled, almost indulgently. "But of course, a puzzle is solved not by shouting each piece as you find it, but by placing them in the only arrangement where they all belong." He replaced the book on the shelf and turned. "Tonight, Inspector, we shall see another move in this game. Our thief of the will and our strangler. They are not the same hand, I think, but they are tangled. And when one pulls too hard," he mimed a knot tightening, "the other will feel it." Outside, the winter light was already fading, the sky sliding toward pearl gray. Poirot stood a moment at the window, looking out toward the river where a faint mist was beginning to gather. In the distance, the bell at the village church struck the quarter hour, the sound carrying thin and clear through the cold air. Poirot's eyes softened. "Yes," he murmured. "Fog will serve us very well indeed." And in his pocket, the handkerchief with its smear of red dye lay folded beside the pale cotton fibre, 2 threads ready to be drawn together when the time came. Chapter 11. Tensions rise. By late afternoon, the sky had dulled to the color of tarnished silver, and the mist rising from the Loire was creeping up the banks, softening the edges of the landscape. Inside, the chateau's corridors carried a low hum. Voices kept to a careful pitch, the occasional clink of porcelain from the drawing-room, the muted thud of a servant's steps on the carpet. It was the quiet before a storm, not of weather, but of tempers. Poirot had arranged for the principal guests to gather in the small blue salon, ostensibly for tea. The room, with its silk-covered chairs and pale painted panels, was a study in elegance, but the air was thick with the weight of unsaid things. The Countess sat in her habitual place by the fire, the flames casting a faint shimmer on the pearls at her throat. Henri lounged opposite her, but his posture was taut despite the lazy angle, his fingers drumming on the armrest. Madame Rochelle, in a dark gown now, occupied the settee, her gloved hands folded, the set of her shoulders suggesting readiness for battle. The Charpentiers sat together, the husband making occasional sotto voce remarks to his wife, who responded with sharp, economical nods. Elise Boulanger, quiet as ever, had chosen a chair slightly apart, the steam from her teacup curling in front of her face like a veil. Fournier stood by the door, leaning against the frame, his eyes moving over the group like a man counting cards. Poirot, seated in the middle of the arrangement, appeared the picture of serenity, stirring a small spoon in his cup as though time itself could be coaxed into order. It began with Henri. "I don't see the point of this," he said, breaking the brittle stillness. "We sit here like suspects in a cheap novel while the gendarmes trample the gardens and pour through our rooms. If Inspector Fournier already has his man, why continue this charade?" Fournier's brow creased, but Poirot answered first. "Because, Monsieur Henri, guilt does not always belong to the most convenient hand, and because the truth, like the fog outside, sometimes obscures the path until the traveler is willing to walk it in full." Madame Rochelle gave a low laugh. "Very poetic, Monsieur Poirot, but perhaps you enjoy keeping us all in this suspense. It flatters your profession, does it not?" "I assure you, madame, I take no pleasure in prolonging discomfort," Poirot said mildly. "But discomfort loosens tongues, and already I hear threads pulling loose." "What threads?" Madame Charpentier's voice was sharp, though she kept her eyes fixed on her teacup. "Rumor? Speculation?" "The threads that connect each of you to Monsieur Marchand," Poirot said. He set his cup down with precision. "The debts, the partnerships, the secrets that bound you to him, each of these is a thread. Some are red, like the one around his neck. Some are white, like the one that vanished with the Countess's old will." The Countess's lips tightened, but she said nothing. Elise, however, spoke for the first time. "And some threads are pulled by more than one hand." Henri's head turned sharply toward her. "What do you mean?" She sipped her tea before replying. "That when something unravels, it is rarely the work of one person alone. A knot like that," she glanced at Poirot, "holds because it has been tied over time, by different pressures, different fears." "A fine metaphor," Madame Rochelle said dryly, "but it's meaningless unless you name the hands." Elise met her gaze without flinching. "Perhaps you know them already." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Fournier straightened, sensing the shift. Poirot, however, leaned back slightly, his expression one of almost paternal interest. "You see, Inspector," Poirot said softly, "when pressure builds, the alliance shifts. One deflects suspicion onto another, another hints at knowledge best kept unspoken. It is a delicate dance. But when the music changes—" "The music," Henri cut in, "is being played by you, Monsieur Poirot. You set the tempo." "Perhaps," Poirot allowed, "but I am not the one who begins to stumble." His gaze drifted to Madame Rochelle, whose composure was starting to show hairline cracks. "I don't care for these insinuations," she said. "If you have an accusation, make it outright." "Accusations are for the inspector," Poirot replied. "I prefer to observe. For example, last night you stood by the fireplace at the moment the toast was raised. The perfume from your gown clings to the marble mantle still. That same mantle bears the faintest mark of a gloved hand, powdered, just as your gloves are now. And yet you say you were never within arm's reach of Monsieur Marchand's chair." She laughed, but it was brittle. "So I cannot stand near a mantle now without being accused of murder." "No, Madame," Poirot said gently. "You can stand near a mantle without being accused, but not without being noticed." Madame Charpentier, perhaps sensing the heat shifting, decided to add her own fuel. "If we are noticing, perhaps someone should mention that Mademoiselle Boulanger was seen taking an envelope from the library table this morning. Is that not so, Inspector?" Elise's gaze did not waver. "And if I did? Perhaps I believed it to be mine." Fournier opened his mouth, but Poirot's hand lifted in a small, deliberate gesture. "Ah, mademoiselle, the beauty of truth is that it can be spoken simply. And yet you embroider it. That is what interests me. The one who ties a perfect knot will sometimes make a needless stitch when nervous." Elise's eyes narrowed just enough for Poirot to see the reaction she wished to hide. The room had tightened now, each person's attention drawn taut as the red thread itself. Outside, the fog was pressing closer against the windows, the outlines of the riverbank fading into pale shadow. The Countess finally spoke, her voice steady but cold. "This cannot continue. You are setting us against each other, Monsieur Poirot." "Aye." Poirot's eyebrows lifted. "No, madame. The tensions between you already existed. I'm merely pulling gently upon them to see which will fray first." As if to prove his point, Henri turned to Madame Rochelle. "You've been circling this from the start, making your little remarks. What did Marchand have on you?" She gave him a slow, disdainful look. "More than he had on you, I suspect." Henri's jaw clenched. "Careful, madame." "Or what?" she said. The air between them was knife-sharp now, and Fournier stepped forward as though ready to intervene. Poirot, however, remained seated, his gaze fixed not on the speakers, but on Elise, who was watching the exchange with an intensity that spoke of calculation rather than curiosity. Poirot smiled to himself. Just a fraction. The fog outside was thickening, and so was the fog inside the room. Somewhere in this mist of shifting alliances, the true killer was maneuvering, and soon they would be forced to make their next move. "Inspector," Poirot said at last, rising to his feet, "perhaps we should adjourn for now. This conversation, like certain threads, will only tighten if left under tension." Fournier nodded, though reluctantly, and began ushering the guests out. The Countess left first, followed by Henri, then the Charpentier. Madame Rochelle lingered a moment longer before sweeping out, and Elise was last, her expression unreadable. When the room was empty, Poirot stood by the fire, looking down at the arm of the chair where Marchand had died. His fingers brushed the spot where he knew the faint red smudge still lingered, invisible to all but him. "Yes," he murmured, "the knot is holding, for now. But not for long." Chapter 12. The Confrontation. Evening settled on the chateau with a strange, muffled stillness. The fog had climbed from the river bank and now pressed itself against the windows, blurring the outlines of the gardens and swallowing the first lights of the village beyond. Inside, lamps glowed in small pools of gold, leaving the corners of the corridors in shadow. The sense of confinement, of being cut off from the world, was complete. Poirot had been expecting movement. When people are penned together in suspicion, alliances form and falter with the changing hours. Now, with tempers frayed and the fog to conceal them, he knew someone would attempt to adjust the pieces on the board in their favor. It was just after 7:30 when it happened. Poirot had stationed himself in the long gallery, a dim stretch of portraits and tall windows where footsteps could be heard from either end. He was ostensibly admiring a late Villeneuve ancestor in powdered wig and hunting dress when a quick, light tread came from the far end. Elise Boulanger emerged from the side staircase, a slim leather folio in her hands. She moved with care, glancing once over her shoulder before slipping through the narrow door to the Countess's study. Poirot did not follow at once. He waited, counting slowly under his breath, then moved noiselessly to the door. Through the slight gap, he saw Elise kneeling by the bureau, the folio open, the envelope with the Countess's missing will laid atop it. She was reading, not hurriedly, but with the focused care of someone confirming details. A shadow fell across the doorway, and Poirot stepped back into the gallery as Madame Rochelle came down the corridor from the other direction. She entered the study without hesitation. "What are you doing?" Rochelle's voice was low but sharp. "Making sure," Elise replied evenly. "You told me it was gone. I wanted to see it for myself." "It was gone," Rochelle said. "Poirot set a trap for whoever took it, and you obligingly walked into it. And now," Elise's tone did not waver, "do you intend to fetch him? Or would you rather we talk plainly? For once." "I think," Madame Rochelle said, closing the door behind her, "that we had better come to an understanding." Poirot's ear, close to the panel, caught only fragments after that. Mentions of the arrangement with Marchand, what was promised, and no more delays. The voices shifted between controlled calm and the quickened sharpness of two people whose patience with each other was very nearly spent. Then the door opened, and both women stepped out, faces composed but eyes bright with something harder than politeness. Elise carried the folio, now closed. Rochelle walked a fraction ahead, as though to make it appear she had been the one in possession all along. Poirot allowed them to pass before turning into the study. The bureau drawer stood half open, the inkwell moved slightly from its usual place. On the blotter lay a handkerchief, white linen, faintly scented, with a tiny spot of pink at one corner. Poirot picked it up delicately. A trace of red thread dye, he thought, not proof yet, but another stitch in the pattern. Later that evening, Poirot sent discreet word to Fournier. He wished to speak with Madame Rochelle privately in the library. Fournier, curious, agreed. At 8 o'clock sharp, Rochelle entered, her expression controlled but watchful. "You wish to question me alone?" she asked. "Not to question," Poirot replied, gesturing to the chair opposite. "To clarify. Last night you told Monsieur Marchand you were done with being useful. Yet today you hover over the Countess's affairs, intercept her missing will, and confer with Mademoiselle Boulanger as if the two of you were partners." Her smile was faint. "We have a mutual interest in certain matters, that is all. And in Marchand's death, in that we have no interest," she said. "Dead men can't pay, and they can't sell. Unless," Poirot said softly, "their death erases a debt or a promise that could not be kept." Rochelle's eyes narrowed. "What exactly are you implying, Monsieur Poirot?" "That you were close enough to Marchand last night to touch his collar without causing alarm," Poirot said, his tone almost conversational. "Close enough that your perfume remains on the marble by the fireplace. Close enough, perhaps, to steady yourself with one hand on his chair while the other tied the knot." Her laugh was quick and sharp. "You think I strangled a man in a room full of people, in full view, and no one saw? That is absurd." "Yes," Poirot agreed, "it is absurd. Unless the act was so small, so quick, and so perfectly masked as something else, a flirtation, a whisper, a speck brushed from a lapel, that no one thought to remark upon it. That requires confidence, and you, madame, have confidence in abundance. She leaned forward, her eyes glinting. If you had proof, you would be at the magistrate's door already, but you don't. So until you do, I suggest you tread carefully. Poirot inclined his head. And yet, he said softly, it is not I who must tread carefully now. Rochelle rose, her composure intact, but her jaw tight. Good evening, Monsieur Poirot. When she had gone, Fournier stepped from the shadow near the door where he had been listening. You wanted to rattle her, he said. I wanted to see if she would betray fear or anger, Poirot replied. Fear can be hidden. Anger, less so. And which did you see? A little of both, Poirot said, slipping the pink-stained handkerchief from his pocket, and perhaps something more, the knowledge that the next move is not hers to make. He glanced toward the window. The fog outside was thicker now, pressing against the glass like a second wall. Somewhere in this house, he thought, the real killer was beginning to feel the walls closing in, and that, for Hercule Poirot, was always the moment when the knot began to loosen. Chapter 13. A desperate attempt to escape. The fog that had been creeping over the Loire all evening had, by 9:30, swallowed the gardens entirely. Beyond the terrace, there was nothing but a pale, impenetrable wall. The chateau's lights glowed like islands, their reflections caught and blurred in the mist. It was the kind of night that muffled sound and erased distance, a night well suited to those who wished to vanish unseen. Poirot had not left the gallery since his conversation with Madame Rochelle. He was waiting, not for her specifically, but for the inevitable reaction that always came when pressure was applied in just the right place. Somewhere in the house, someone was weighing the risk of staying against the peril of acting. In Poirot's experience, the desperate rarely chose inaction. The first sign came not from a sound, but from a draught. A faint shift of air reached him from the direction of the service corridor, accompanied by the smell of damp stone. Poirot moved toward it without haste, his soft-soled shoes silent on the carpet. From the shadowed end of the passage, he saw a figure, slim, quick-moving, slip through the door to the side courtyard. The fog rolled in as the door opened, curling around the intruder's legs before they pulled it shut behind them. Poirot followed, keeping to the side wall. The cold was immediate, the damp clinging to his coat. Through the fog, shapes loomed, garden urns, clipped yews, but the figure ahead was little more than a darker shadow in the gray. It moved swiftly toward the wrought iron gate that led down to the river path. A second shape detached itself from the mist on the left. Fournier. He had seen the same movement from another corridor and come out through a different door. Between them, they closed the distance. The figure reached the gate and began working at the latch with hurried precision. Poirot recognized the economy of the movements, someone accustomed to fastening and unfastening with speed. Bonsoir, mademoiselle, Poirot said into the fog. Elise Boulanger froze, her hand still on the latch. Slowly she turned, her face pale in the diffused light from the house. I needed air, she said. In such haste? Poirot asked, stepping closer, and with the Countess's folio under your arm. She glanced down as though surprised to find it there. I was returning it. To the river? Fournier's voice was hard. Elise's eyes narrowed. I thought it safer to remove it from this house until... Until what? Poirot asked gently. Until the knot could be tied a second time? Her lips pressed together. You think I killed him. I didn't. But you would destroy what proves you had a reason, Poirot said. That will you took. It contains a change that cost you something, yes? Perhaps an inheritance, perhaps a promise made by Marchand on the Countess's behalf. And when you saw the chance to remove that proof, you took it. Fournier stepped forward, his hand out. The folio. For a moment, Poirot thought she would refuse. Then she handed it over, her movements tight with restrained anger. "Inside," Fournier ordered. In the library, with the door shut against the fog, the Countess received the folio in silence. She did not open it. She only placed it on the desk as though setting down something distasteful. "You will not leave the house again tonight, mademoiselle," she said coldly. Elise met her gaze. "I was never your prisoner." "Perhaps not," Poirot said softly, "but the fog outside is treacherous. One could easily lose one's way, just as one can lose oneself in a web of lies." When Elise had been escorted upstairs by a gendarme, Fournier turned to Poirot. "You think she's the killer after all?" Poirot shook his head. "No. Her attempt to leave was desperation, yes, but not the desperation of a murderer evading the law. This was about the will, not the death. Her urgency tells us that whatever is in that document is dangerous to her in another way entirely. And it also tells us something else, that the killer, for now, feels safe enough to stay in the shadows and let suspicion cling to her." Fournier frowned. "Then who do you think we're really looking at?" Poirot's eyes rested on the folio. "We are looking," he said slowly, "for someone who could approach Marchand without fear, tie a knot with the left hand while steadying themselves with the right, and do so in a moment disguised as intimacy or courtesy. Someone who had both the skill and the confidence. The will, mon cher, is a distraction. One thread twisted around another. But I've already begun to see where the red and white threads meet." He glanced toward the tall windows where the fog pressed against the glass like a living thing. "And when they meet, Inspector, the knot will not hold much longer." Somewhere above, a door closed softly. Poirot's eyes sharpened. The house was quiet again, but the fog outside was no longer the only thing thickening. The air within these walls was charged with a new kind of urgency, the kind that comes when someone realizes the window for action is closing fast. Chapter 14. The final piece falls into place. The fog pressed so thick against the windows that it seemed the chateau had been cast adrift, its lamps the only lights in an unbroken sea of grey. By 10 o'clock, the house had fallen into an uneasy stillness. The guests had withdrawn to their rooms under the quiet but unmistakable guard of Fournier's men, and the clatter of the kitchen had dwindled to an occasional muffled sound. Poirot remained in the library, alone but for the steady tick of the ormolu clock on the mantel. He had before him 3 small objects: the folded handkerchief with its pink stain of thread dye, the pale cotton fibre plucked from the guest book pedestal, and the scrap of paper toweling taken from the linen room bin. Each lay on the green baize surface like pieces of a puzzle waiting for their edges to align. He touched the handkerchief first. The dye stain was small, but it had bled into the weave of the linen, a mark unlikely to have been made by casual contact. Whoever had tied the red thread had handled it long enough, firmly enough, for the color to transfer and cling. The fiber was the next. Cotton, slightly fuzzy, and not of the sort used in evening garments. Service uniforms, perhaps. It suggested proximity to the lower workings of the house, a place the Countess's society guests rarely ventured. The scrap of paper toweling bore the faint smell of soap and starch. The pink stain upon it was lighter than on the handkerchief, as if someone had tried to scrub the dye from their fingertips before rejoining the company. Poirot could picture it. A quick detour to the pantry or linen room, hands working under the tap. A scrap of toweling snatched up to finish the job before stepping back into the light. He sat back, fingertips pressed together. It was not one clue alone, but the harmony of them, the way they chimed together like notes in a chord, that told him what he needed. He now knew which hand had tied the knot, and why the murderer had been able to move so close to Paul Marchand without drawing notice. The door opened softly, and Fournier entered, a sheaf of reports under his arm. "You're still here," he said. "I thought you might have retired." "Ah, mon ami," Poirot said, "there is no rest for the little grey cells when the last piece has just been fitted into the frame." Fournier looked wary. You've solved it, then? Poirot's eyes gleamed. Yes. And I will tell you this much. The killer is still walking these halls, still certain their place in this household is secure. That certainty will make them careless. Tonight, we do nothing. Tomorrow morning, we will act, and you will have your proof laid neatly before you. You want to wait? Fournier said, clearly resisting the impulse to push forward. You'd let them have another night in which to change their story, or worse. Poirot shook his head. No, they will not run. They think themselves unassailable. But I require the stage to be perfectly set, so that when the curtain rises, all the players are in their places, and the truth can be shown in one sweep. Fournier hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. You'd better be right. When the inspector had gone, Poirot rose and crossed to the window. The fog was shifting now, thick and pale. The lamplight from the terrace making only a faint glow in the grayness. Somewhere in the house above, a floorboard creaked, followed by the muted sound of a door latch. Poirot turned his head slightly, listening. It came again, 2 rooms away in the guest corridor. A soft, deliberate movement. Not the restless pacing of Henri, nor the brisk step of Madame Rochelle. This was quieter, more measured, the sound of someone who did not wish to be heard. Poirot moved to the library door and opened it just enough to see into the dim corridor beyond. The sound had already faded, but in its place was the faintest scent, clean starch and a whisper of powder. He smiled to himself. Even now, they could not help leaving a trace. He returned to his desk and began to write in his small, precise hand. It was not a confession. Those he left to others, but a sequence. A reconstruction of the evening, step by step, knot by knot, until the moment Paul Marchand's head fell to the side and the room's chatter began to ripple into alarm. By the time the clock struck 11, he had finished. He folded the pages, placed them in an envelope, and slipped it into the inner pocket of his coat. Then he rang for Madame Vautrin. When the housekeeper appeared, her expression as guarded as ever, as Poirot gave her a mild smile. Madame, tomorrow morning I shall require the ballroom prepared for a gathering of all the guests, at precisely 9 o'clock. Coffee for everyone. Oh, and the armchair where Monsieur Marchand was seated should be placed exactly as it was during the final toast. She inclined her head, though her eyes searched his face for more. Will that be all, Monsieur Poirot? For tonight, yes, Poirot said. And perhaps, Madame, you might see that no one has cause to leave the house before then. I would consider it unfortunate if our company were diminished. When she had gone, Poirot stood for a moment in the center of the library, listening again to the muted sounds of the chateau. He could feel the shape of the morning already. Faces turning toward him, some wary, some defiant. One certain it has nothing to fear until the truth snaps tight around it. In the fog-bound quiet, he allowed himself the smallest, most satisfied of smiles. The final piece had fallen into place. Now it was only a matter of showing it to the others, and watching the knot that had held so tight come undone in a single, elegant pull. Chapter 15. The final gathering. Morning came pale and cold. The fog still clinging low over the gardens as if reluctant to leave. The Countess's staff had, under Poirot's quiet instructions, restored the ballroom to its appearance on the night of the murder. The armchair where Paul Marchand had sat was returned to its place near the marble fireplace, its fabric brushed, its carved arms polished. Even the guest-book pedestal stood once more in its original position by the wall, a fresh pen poised above the open page. At precisely 9 o'clock, the guests assembled. They entered in 2s and 3s, shepherded by Fournier's men, their expressions varying from irritation to a guarded wariness. The Countess swept in first, her bearing regal despite the strain of the past 2 days. Henry followed, hands thrust into his pockets, his gaze flicking quickly over the room as though assessing its layout for escape routes. Madame Rochelle was next, serene in a black gown, her gloved hands folded, eyes betraying nothing. The Charpentiers came together, the husband attempting a genial nod to Poirot, which was met with only a polite dip of the detective's head. Finally, Elise Boulanger entered, quiet and composed, her silver ring catching the morning light as she clasped her hands before her. Fournier took up his place near the doors, flanked by two gendarmes. Poirot, standing in the center of the room, waited until all eyes were on him before he began. "Mesdames, messieurs," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the high-ceilinged space, "we are gathered this morning not to speculate, but to resolve. 2 crimes have been committed within these walls, the murder of Monsieur Paul Marchand and the theft of a document from the Countess's study. They are not, I think, unrelated." A faint stir passed through the group. Madame Rochelle tilted her head slightly, while Henri's mouth tightened. Elise looked at Poirot without expression. Poirot continued, stepping slowly toward the armchair. "Let us begin with the murder. Monsieur Marchand was strangled in this very seat. The weapon was a length of red parcel twine taken from the butler's pantry. The knot was tied quickly, efficiently, and from the front, indicating that the killer faced him, close enough for conversation, close enough that he felt no alarm until the thread tightened. He rested a hand on the chair's arm. The murderer's left hand tied the knot, while the right rested here. How do I know this? Because the right armrest bore a faint smear of red dye, the same dye that had transferred to a certain person's glove and handkerchief. From his pocket, Poirot drew the folded linen square, its pink stain visible even in the cool morning light. He held it up. "This, mesdames et messieurs, is the handkerchief of Madame Rochelle." There was a ripple. Madame Charpentier's eyes widened. Henri glanced sharply toward Rochelle. She did not move, but her gaze on Poirot was steady. "You accuse me because of a stain?" she said, her tone controlled. "I do not accuse you," Poirot replied mildly. "The stain alone is nothing, but combined with other details, it is the final thread in a pattern." He turned from her, addressing the room. The killer needed 2 things to succeed: proximity to Marchand without suspicion, and the skill to tie a knot that would hold until death, without fumbling. That skill is not common. It belongs to those who work with fabric, cord, or rope in precise ways. A sailor, perhaps, a craftsman, or— He turned his gaze deliberately. A conservator of textiles. All eyes shifted to Elise. She met them without flinching. I tied no knot around his neck. Poirot inclined his head. "No. But you, mademoiselle, know the constrictor's knot as well as you know the weft and warp of a tapestry. And it is that knot, tied by a left hand, that ended Marchand's life. You also had a motive. He wished to draw you into his schemes of forgery, to have you provide authentic fragments to dress his forgeries. You refused, and so, on the night of the gala, you confronted him." "That is a story," Elise said. "But you have no proof I confronted him at all." "Ah, but I do," Poirot said, and from his pocket he drew the small scrap of paper toweling from the linen-room bin. "This bears the same dye as the red twine and was used to scrub it from the fingertips. It also bears a faint trace of starch from the service uniforms. The cotton fiber I found at the guest book pedestal came from the cuff of your work dress, the one you wore when you went into the study that afternoon. That dress is not here now. You removed it from your room after the murder. And yet," he gestured to her wrist, "the faint mark from the twine remains." Elise's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Poirot took a step closer, lowering his voice slightly, though all could still hear. "You went to Marchand, as the toast was called. You leaned down, perhaps to murmur something, perhaps to adjust his collar under the guise of courtesy. The knot was tied, the ends hidden under the fold. He had time only for one breath before the pressure took it from him. You walked away into the crowd as the room turned to the Countess raising her glass. No one saw. Fournier moved, but Poirot lifted a hand to still him. Yet you are not the only one with guilt, mademoiselle. The theft of the will," he looked toward Madame Rochelle, "was not your doing. That was the work of another hand entirely, one who hoped to profit from changes that document revealed. But in taking it yourself after the murder, you linked the two crimes, and that is what allowed me to see where the threads crossed." The Countess's voice, cold and precise, cut through the air. "If you are certain, Monsieur Poirot, then I will have her removed from my house at once." Poirot shook his head. "Not yet, madame, for there is still one detail, the note found in Marchand's pocket. It is almost time. Be ready. That note was not from Mademoiselle Boulanger. It was from the true instigator of this chain of events, the one who lured her to that chair, knowing her temper, knowing her skill, and trusting that in the moment she would act. That person is still here among us, waiting to see if their little scheme has worked." A faint tremor passed through the group. Henri shifted in his chair. Madame Charpentier's embroidery hoop trembled in her lap, and Madame Rochelle's gloved hands tightened fractionally. Poirot's eyes moved from face to face. "This morning I will name them, but before I do I wish to give them the chance to speak. A final courtesy before the knot is pulled tight." Silence fell. Outside, the fog began to thin, a pale sunlight breaking through in long, slow shafts, as if the day itself were leaning forward to listen. Chapter 16. The Reveal. The silence in the ballroom stretched, brittle and heavy. Sunlight was beginning to find the windows now, thin bars of gold cutting through the receding fog, but no one seemed to notice. All eyes were on Poirot, and Poirot, hands neatly folded before him, looked as though he could stand there another hour without saying a word. It was Henri who broke first. "This is absurd," he said, his voice too quick. "If you have something to say, Poirot, say it. You're playing with people's lives." Poirot inclined his head slightly, as though acknowledging a point in chess. "Indeed, monsieur. And yet it is not I who set these pieces upon the board. It was the one who decided Paul Marchand must die, and who arranged matters so that another might take the blame." He stepped away from the armchair and walked toward the guest-book pedestal. "The plan was elegant in its way. You, the true instigator, sent the note to Marchand. It is almost time. Be ready." Those words promised the meeting he had been expecting, a conversation in which he believed himself to hold the advantage. You knew he would sit in this chair, and you ensured Mademoiselle Boulanger would be close at hand, angry, perhaps, from some earlier exchange, and with all the skill necessary to act without hesitation. Elise's eyes narrowed. "I told you, I didn't—" Poirot held up a hand. "Patience, mademoiselle. I do not excuse your actions, but I understand them. In that moment, you were provoked, manipulated into becoming the weapon. The knot was tied by your hand, yes, but the murder began elsewhere, in the mind of another." He let his gaze drift across the group before settling, with a small inevitability, on Henri. "Monsieur Henri, you knew Marchand from Paris. You knew his methods, his dealings, and his hold over certain people, including your aunt's acquaintance, Madame Rochelle. More importantly, you knew about the 1918 will, in which your position within the family fortunes was stronger than under the current one. You also knew that Marchand had taken an interest in Elise's refusal to cooperate with his forgeries, and that he would try again to bend her to his purpose. And so, you saw an opportunity. Marchand's death would remove a dangerous associate, and the manner of it, carried out by someone with her skills, would seem an impulsive act on her part." Henri's jaw had gone rigid. "That's ridiculous." "Is it?" Poirot asked softly. "On the night of the gala, you claimed to be in the antechamber with your friend Vermorel. Yet your shoes bear no trace of the carpet dust from there, but a faint mark of the parquet wax from this very room. You signed the guest book shortly before Marchand, and the ink smear on your cuff shows you brushed the wet page. That placed you near enough to overhear his brief exchange with Elise earlier in the evening. It was you, monsieur, who whispered to her that Marchand was asking questions about her work. You wanted her ready to confront him, to lean close, to make her move without thinking. Henri's nostrils flared. You have nothing but speculation. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Ah, but I have more. The cotton fiber I found at the pedestal, it was from the cuff of a servant's jacket, yes, but not from a servant. It came from your own shooting jacket, which you wore when you inspected the renovations last month. The frayed cuff caught on the wood when you adjusted the pedestal, perhaps to ensure the guest book was positioned so you could see who signed. And there is the white thread, identical in weave to the red, that I found on the ballroom rug. That, monsieur, came from the decoy coil you placed in your own pocket, a spare, to make it seem the twine had been fetched by another. A murmur ran through the room. Henri's face had darkened, but he stayed silent. Poirot went on, his tone now with the precision of a man stitching the last seam. When Marchand died, you let the room react. You knew suspicion would drift toward Elise, her proximity, her skill with knots, her earlier conversation with him. And while Fournier's attention was on her, you entered your aunt's study later that night and took the will. You planned to remove it quietly, but when the murder threatened to keep us all here longer than expected, you entrusted it to another, Madame Rochelle, to keep it hidden until the moment you could use it. Madame Rochelle's lips curved into the faintest, most dangerous of smiles. And if I say nothing, you will say nothing, Madame, Poirot replied, because your silence now keeps the matter of your dealings with Marchand from being aired in a less private forum. The Countess, who had remained very still throughout, now spoke. Henri, she said, her voice low, tell me this is not true. Henri's eyes met hers, and for the first time his bravado faltered. It wasn't supposed to happen that way. I only meant to frighten him, to make him back off. He jerked his head toward Elise. Took it further than I thought. Elise's cheeks flushed, but her voice was steady. You set me up. Henri said nothing. Poirot stepped back, allowing Fournier to move forward. Inspector, the matter is now in your hands. I believe you will find the knot we have unraveled leaves nothing hidden. Fournier signaled to the gendarmes, who stepped to either side of Henri. The young man did not resist, only gave a single, sharp look toward Poirot, before being led toward the door. In the quiet that followed, Poirot smoothed his moustaches and addressed the remaining guests. And thus, mesdames et messieurs, the red and white threads have been drawn apart. One bound the victim's life, the other bound an inheritance. Both were meant to be pulled without notice, but as always, he spread his hands. The smallest detail betrays the design. He turned toward the window where the last tatters of fog were lifting from the garden. It is a curious thing, he added softly. In the end, murder and theft are alike in one respect. They both believe themselves to be invisible until the light changes. Chapter 17. Threads yet uncut. The arrest had broken the tension in the ballroom, but not the unease. Conversations began in low, uneasy murmurs, and the scrape of chairs echoed in the gilded space as people shifted in their seats. The Countess, pale but composed, remained by the tall windows, her gloved hands clasped in front of her. Elise sat apart, her gaze fixed on the parquet floor as though afraid that meeting anyone's eyes would invite more questions. Poirot did not move immediately. He stood in the center of the room, letting the voices stir around him like a tide. I had learned long ago that this was not inattention. It was his way of noting who sought whom, who avoided whose gaze, and which alliances were already forming in the wake of the confession. His head tilted just slightly toward Madame Rochelle, who had retreated to a corner with an expression that might have been mild curiosity, had we not known better. Inspector Fournier approached, his steps quick, the tension in his posture still evident. That will be all for now, ladies and gentlemen, he announced. The gendarmes will take statements as needed before you depart. Until then, I ask that you remain available for further questioning. Poirot gave a small bow of the head toward Fournier. "You will forgive me, Inspector, if I do not yet take my leave. I believe a few small matters remain unthreaded." Fournier's brows drew together. "Unthreaded?" "Yes," Poirot said mildly, "and one must always examine the ends of the rope before declaring it coiled." He stepped toward the Countess. "Madame, if I may, your composure this morning is admirable. And yet I suspect this was not the only shock you have endured in recent days." The Countess looked at him steadily, though there was a faint tightening around her eyes. "You have something in mind?" "Merely a small observation," Poirot replied. "When I first arrived, the painting above the mantelpiece, the portrait of your late husband, hung slightly askew. Not the kind of thing one notices unless one has the eye, but it suggested the frame had been touched recently. It is curious, is it not, that such a thing would occur in a room you keep locked?" Her lips curved faintly without warmth. "Perhaps a servant was careless in dusting." "Perhaps," Poirot said, though his tone carried no conviction. "Or perhaps it concealed something of value, something not meant for others to see." Fournier frowned. "What are you implying?" "That even with Monsieur Henri in custody, we may not yet have the full measure of motive," Poirot said. "The will, yes, that was his concern. But I think there is another document, equally dangerous, that has not yet surfaced." He let his eyes rest briefly on Madame Rochelle. "One that could be leveraged by someone with an understanding of delicate scandals and the price of silence." Rochelle's smile was slow, deliberate. "Monsieur Poirot, I find your imagination quite enviable, but perhaps you mistake good manners for secrecy." "Ah," Poirot murmured, "but in my experience, madame, the two are most often companions." The Countess glanced toward Rochelle, something unreadable in her expression. "If there is indeed such a document," she said quietly, "I'm confident it will never trouble you, Inspector. I will see to it personally." Fournier looked from one to the other, clearly uneasy. "Poirot, are you saying we should keep them both under watch?" Poirot considered for a moment, then shook his head. "No, my friend, let them go. The guilty have a way of tying their own knots tighter when they believe themselves free." With that, he crossed to Elise, lowering his voice so only she and I could hear. "Mademoiselle, you understand now how you were drawn into this, but you must also understand your reputation will not mend overnight. Those who doubted you may never change their mind." Her eyes lifted to meet his, the defiance there dimmed by exhaustion. "Then what was the point?" "The point," Poirot said gently, "is that truth is a thread that does not break. Even when it is hidden, it remains, and one day it will be seen." Outside, the fog had thinned into a pale, cold light. The gendarmes led Henri to the waiting car, and Madame Rochelle swept past us with the grace of someone leaving a stage. The Countess followed, her face set in a mask. Poirot lingered at the threshold, looking out across the gravel drive. "Come, Hastings," he said at last. "The matter is concluded, for now. But I have learned one thing, mon ami. When threads are cut too quickly, they fray, and I do not think we have seen the last of these." I fell into step beside him, the echo of his words staying with me longer than the morning's chill. Chapter 18. The Knot Untied. We left the chateau that morning believing the case concluded, but Poirot's manner told me otherwise. He was unusually silent as we traveled back to Tours, his eyes half-lidded, his fingers tapping lightly against his walking stick. By midday, we had taken rooms at the Hôtel de l'Univers, where he immediately requested the use of the writing desk. I watched in bafflement as he laid out the Countess's folio, several of Fournier's notes, and a single square of thick cream paper, the one I'd seen him slip from behind the mantel portrait 2 nights before. It was a letter, unsigned, the ink faint but legible. Written in a precise, elegant hand, it spoke of a debt owed, a promise of marriage once the writer's present obligations had ended, and, most telling of all, an understanding that the writer's benefactor, Marchand, need never be troubled with the particulars. "You took that from the Countess's drawing-room?" I asked. "Oui," Poirot replied, still studying it. "It was hidden well, but not well enough. The Countess believed it safe because she believed the guilty party would never dare to touch it. But the guilty party had already ensured it could be used against her or for her, depending on the turn of events." I leaned closer. "Then this isn't about the will at all." "The will was a diversion, mon ami, a bright ribbon to draw the eye away from the true knot. The murder of Marchand was not about inheritance, it was about silence. He was close to discovering that the Countess had once been engaged to Henri's father before his unfortunate ruin. This letter, had it surfaced, would have been enough to ruin her in society. Marchand's knowledge would have given him leverage over her affairs. And so, Poirot tapped the letter. It had to be stopped. I frowned. "But then Henri?" Poirot shook his head. "Henri is impulsive, grasping, and foolish, yes. But he is not a killer. No, the one who struck was someone who could move freely in Marchand's company. Someone trusted, someone who could serve the wine, adjust his chair, lean close enough to tie that fateful knot without raising suspicion." The image came sharply to me. "Madame Rochelle." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Just so. She was in debt to Marchand, dependent on his favor, but when she learned of the letter and realized he meant to use it for his own advantage, perhaps to force the Countess into terms she could not accept, she acted. The knot in the cravat was hers. The timing of the poisoning was hers. And when suspicion fell upon Elise and then upon Henri, she let it stand. She knew the Countess would protect her, if only to prevent this letter from ever seeing light. We returned to the chateau that afternoon under the pretext of delivering the folio. Fournier met us at the door, surprised to see us. Poirot requested that both the Countess and Madame Rochelle join us in the library. He laid the letter on the desk between them. The Countess's face blanched, while Rochelle's smile did not falter, but her hand closed just slightly over the arm of her chair. "Madame," Poirot said, "you have a gift for discretion. You adjusted Marchand's cravat as you leaned close to murmur something to him, yes? A simple courtesy? No. And yet, in that moment, you tightened it with a twist that would close his throat when the poison began its work. Efficient, subtle, and deadly." Rochelle's gaze shifted from Poirot to the Countess, and for a moment I thought she might deny it. But instead, she leaned back and said, almost lazily, "And if I did? Who will say so? The Countess? She would have to explain this letter. The inspector. He has already made his arrest." Fournier's voice was cold. "Not anymore." Rochelle's eyes flickered, only for an instant, but it was enough. She knew she had lost. The Countess sat very still, her eyes fixed on the letter. "It will be destroyed," she said softly. Poirot inclined his head. "That is your choice, madame. But the truth, it has been spoken, and now the knot." He lifted his hands as though untying an invisible cord. "Is undone." Rochelle was taken into custody quietly, without further word. The Countess left the room, her composure unbroken, though I could not tell whether she considered herself freed or merely diminished. Elise, when told the news, said nothing at all, only nodded, as though she had always known that her own innocence would cost someone else dearly. Later, as we left the chateau for the final time, I remarked to Poirot that the whole business had felt like a tangle of silk threads, beautiful, intricate, but treacherous to the touch. He smiled faintly. "Ah, mon ami, but silk is strong, no? It holds until the moment you find the right end, and then—" He made a small gesture, like pulling a single thread free. "The whole pattern unravels." And so it had.